Cold open. Sounds of a car engine shutting off, a car door closing, a crisp autumn wind. Sloane, thank God. The caterer's late with the appetizers. Grab these. That was the first thing my father said to me. Not hello. Not how was the 4-hour drive from Burlington? Not even a simple nod. Just an order. His back was already turned to me as he thrust a heavy wooden tray of empty wine glasses into my hands before I'd even managed to get my scarf off. My coat was still on. The engine of my 10-year-old Subaru was probably still ticking and cooling in the driveway. He pointed with his chin toward the dining room. Pierce and his new girlfriend will be here any minute. This needs to look perfect. Don't mess this up for him. And there it was, the unofficial family motto. The ghost in the machine of every holiday, every Sunday dinner, every phone call. You are responsible for your brother's success. You are responsible for everyone's comfort. But nobody here is responsible for yours. I was 34 years old, a respected professional with a decade of experience in one of the most demanding fields on earth, and in my father's house I was still the unpaid help. I took a steadying breath, the smell of pine cleaner and roasting turkey filling my lungs, and walked toward the dining room. My name is Sloane Holloway, and this is the story of the last Thanksgiving I ever spent at my parents' house. It's the story of how a single sentence from a woman I barely knew finally gave me permission to do what I should have done a decade earlier. To put down the serving platter, take off the apron I never knew I was wearing, and walk out the front door for good. Before I tell you what she said, and what happened after my father's perfectly curated world came crashing down around that dinner table, do me a favor. Tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you listening to this from? I'm always curious to see just how far a story like this can travel. To understand that night, you have to understand the architecture of my family. It's not complicated, but it is rigid. My father, Whitmore, built his entire identity on the bedrock of financial success. He was a man who spoke the language of stock tickers and quarterly earnings. Love, in his world, was measured in return on investment. My older brother, Pierce, was his blue-chip stock. He'd gone to the right business school, taken the right job in private equity, and mirrored my father's worldview so perfectly that they were less like father and son and more like a senior partner and his prized junior associate. And then there was me. I was in my father's portfolio, the charity write-off. I'm a pediatric ICU nurse. I spend 12-hour shifts in a world of beeping machines, whispered consultations, and the quiet, fierce courage of children fighting for their lives. I titrate drips that can stop a heart if you're off by a single microgram. I have held the hands of parents on the single worst day of their existence. I have celebrated a child being able to breathe on their own after weeks on a ventilator. My job is a landscape of profound, gut-wrenching, and sometimes miraculous moments. To my father, it was Sloane's little hospital thing. He couldn't brag about my salary at the golf club. He couldn't understand a career motivated by something other than a bonus structure. So he minimized it. He'd introduce me with a sigh and a smile. This is Sloane. She's got a big heart, works with sick kids up in Vermont. Very noble. The word noble was always delivered with the same faint pity you'd use for someone who'd chosen to join a monastery. It was his way of saying, she'll never amount to anything financially, but at least it sounds nice. This dynamic was carved in stone. For years I had played my part. I'd show up for holidays, accept the gentle condescension, and quietly work to make everything run smoothly. I'd refill drinks, shuttle dishes to the kitchen, and listen to my father praise Pierce for closing a deal, conveniently forgetting that Pierce had only been able to start his own consulting firm because my parents had co-signed an $87,000 loan for his MBA. I remembered that number vividly, because 2 years later, when I'd saved up most of a down payment for a small condo near the hospital, I had asked them for help with the last $15,000. The answer had been a firm, regretful no. Money's tight right now, honey. My mother had said, while in the background I could hear my dad on the phone talking about booking a trip to Pebble Beach. That was the moment I started keeping records. Look, it wasn't born of resentment, not at first. I was an accounting student for 2 years in college before I had a clinical rotation in the pediatric wing and realized I couldn't spend my life balancing books when I could be helping people. But the training stuck. My first accounting professor used to say, "Good paperwork prevents bad feelings. Memory is emotional, but a signature is a fact." So I started a small private ledger in a simple notebook. Not for them, but for me. For my own sanity, I documented the MBA loan, the down payment refusal, and, most importantly, the $4,850 I had loaned Pierce myself 5 years earlier when he had a can't-miss startup idea that fizzled out in 6 months. He'd been desperate, and I'd just gotten a small inheritance from my grandmother. I'd transferred the money, and because my professor's voice was still rattling around in my head, I'd printed a simple promissory note from the internet. I remember him laughing as he signed it. "Sloane, it's me." "You really need this?" And I'd laughed back. Just humor my weird accounting brain, I put the note in a file folder, and over the years, as he never mentioned it again, it became a quiet symbol of the one-way financial street in our family. This was the context I carried with me into the dining room that Thanksgiving. The weight of it was heavier than the tray of glasses in my hands. My mother bustled past, avoiding my eyes. "Sloane, could you use the sterling silver?" Ainsley's parents are members at the country club. We want to make a good impression. The we in that sentence did not include me. The we was the team dedicated to ensuring Pierce's continued ascent. I was just the roadie for his rock band. I opened the velvet-lined chest and began setting out the heavy, ornate silverware we used maybe once a year. Each fork, each knife felt like a small anchor holding me in a role I had long since outgrown. By the time the doorbell rang, the scene was set. The table was a masterpiece of classic New England affluence. Candles were lit. The scent of my mother's perfectly timed side dishes filled the air. My father's business partner, Mr. Carmichael, and his wife were already there, laughing with my dad in the living room. My aunts and uncles were trickling in, complaining about the traffic on the I-95. And I was standing by the sideboard, a dish towel tucked into my waistband, making a final check of the wine glasses. My own place setting, as always, was at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen, the seat for the person who's never fully sitting down. Then the front door opened, and a wave of performative enthusiasm washed through the foyer. "There he is," my father boomed. Pierce walked in, radiating the easy confidence of a man who has never had to question his place in the world. On his arm was a woman with intelligent eyes and a calm, self-possessed posture. This was Ainsley. She smiled politely at my parents, shook Mr. Carmichael's hand, and then as my brother guided her toward the living room, her eyes swept the space. They went past my aunt, past the grand floral arrangement, and then they landed on me and stopped. It wasn't a glance, it was a lock. The polite social mask on her face didn't just slip, it fell away. The color drained from her cheeks. Her steps faltered. For a split second, she looked at me with an expression of such raw, visceral shock, it was like she was seeing a ghost. I saw her hand tighten on the strap of her leather tote bag. My brother, oblivious, kept his hand on the small of her back, murmuring introductions. But Ainsley wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on me, the sister standing by the buffet, the woman in the sensible sweater holding a bottle of Chardonnay. I froze, my mind racing. Where did I know this woman from? A college class, some random coffee shop in Burlington? The intensity of her reaction felt deeply personal. It felt clinical. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. She blinked, and the mask was back in place. She composed herself with the speed of someone used to managing their expressions. She turned to my mother, complimented the house, and allowed Pierce to lead her away. But as she passed, her eyes met mine again, just for a second. And this time there was no shock. There was just a silent, profound, and deeply unsettling question. Dinner began as a symphony of practiced denial. Plates were passed. My father held court, telling a story about a recent market fluctuation with the gravitas of a war general recounting a major battle. My mother asked Ainsley about her law firm, her voice pitched with a particular kind of reverence reserved for high-earning professions. Mr. Carmichael chimed in with a booming laugh, and the conversation flowed around me, a river I was standing beside, not in. I performed my role on autopilot. I noticed my uncle's water glass was empty and refilled it without being asked. I saw the butter dish was low and quietly slipped into the kitchen to replace it. Each movement was a testament to years of training, of learning to anticipate needs to avoid the greater discomfort of being useless. An aunt turned to me, her expression kind but distracted. "Sloane, dear, how are things up in Vermont? Still at that hospital?" It was a small opening, a chance to be seen. I took a breath. "It's been intense lately. We had a really tough case with a preemie, but he just got extubated last week, which was amazing. I'm just so..." Sloane's got such a soft spot for those kids. My father cut in, his voice loud enough to reclaim the table's attention. He smiled benignly, as if bestowing a compliment. "It's basically a calling for her." "Almost like being in the Peace Corps, but with better heating," the table chuckled, a polite, accommodating sound. Mr. Carmichael's wife patted my arm. "That's just so wonderful. You must be a saint." My cheeks burned. I wasn't a saint. I was a highly trained medical professional. The phrase, almost like the Peace Corps, was a masterpiece of dismissal. It erased the grueling years of nursing school, the brutal board exams, the constant recertifications, the sheer scientific and emotional complexity of my work. It painted me as a doe-eyed volunteer, a well-meaning girl with a hobby. I felt the familiar knot tighten in my stomach, the urge to argue, to defend myself, immediately followed by the wave of exhaustion at the thought of the ensuing conflict. So, as always, I swallowed it. I gave a tight smile and focused on cutting my turkey into unnecessarily small pieces. I folded my hands in my lap so they wouldn't see them shake. Then, inevitably, the spotlight swung to Pierce. "Pierce," my dad said, his whole posture changing. He leaned forward, his voice booming with pride. "Tell Ainsley's parents what you told me about the new fund. The projections are staggering." For the next 10 minutes, they talked about capital, about leverage, about emerging markets. My father fed Pierce leading questions, acting as both interviewer and publicist. He inflated Pierce's role using words like visionary and architect. He was practically glowing. And then my aunt, the one who'd asked about my job, delivered the question that would change everything. Perhaps she'd had just enough wine to be sincere. She smiled warmly at my father. "Whitmore, you must be so incredibly proud of both of your children. They're both so successful in their own ways." The question, so simple and normal, landed in the center of that table like a grenade. The air went still. There was a beat of silence. It was just a fraction of a second, but in that tiny gap, the truth of the room lived. My father had a script for praising Pierce. He had a script for dismissing me. He had no script for putting us in the same sentence as equals. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. "Of course," he said a little too loudly. "Pierce has built something incredible, a real legacy." He went on for another minute about Pierce's business acumen. Then, with a perfunctory glance down the table in my direction, he added, "And Sloane is doing great work, too. A very different path, but she's always followed her heart." A different path. Followed her heart. It was code. It meant the one who doesn't contribute to the family's image. It was a pat on the head, an honorable mention. And that's when I heard it, a small, sharp, metallic sound. Clink. Across the table, Ainsley had set her fork down against the rim of her plate. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the stem of her wine glass. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. And for the first time since she had walked in, she wasn't looking at Pierce or my mother or the centerpiece. She was staring directly at my father. "Mr. Holloway," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring like a surgeon's scalpel. Every side conversation ceased. Every eye turned to her. "Can I ask you a question?" My father, caught off guard but still in host mode, gave a magnanimous smile. Of course, Ainsley. Anything. Her eyes, clear and unblinking, did not leave his. Do you actually know what your daughter does? The silence that followed was absolute. It was so deep I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. My father's smile faltered. He gave a small, confused laugh. Well, I think I just said. She works with children. No, Ainsley said, shaking her head slightly. The movement was small, but it was an undeniable interruption. And in that house, at that table, no one interrupted my father. I'm not asking for the version you tell at dinner parties. I'm asking if you have any earthly idea what her work has meant to a family in this state. To my family, my own fork was suddenly impossibly heavy in my hand. My blood felt thick and slow in my veins, because in that single stunning moment, the tumblers of my memory clicked into place. The waiting room, the anxious pacing, the little girl with huge, terrified eyes who wouldn't look at anyone, the woman on the phone, her voice cracking with a mixture of hope and despair. It was her. My little sister, Chloe, Ainsley said, her voice now ringing with a clarity that felt both righteous and terrifying. She was speaking to my father, but her words were for the entire room. My sister Chloe spent 6 weeks in a pediatric ICU 18 months ago with bacterial meningitis. For 12 of those days, she was in a medically induced coma. When she woke up, she couldn't speak, not a word. The doctors called it transient aphasia, a neurological side effect of the inflammation in her brain. They said it could last for days or weeks, or they didn't know. She paused, took a sip of water. My mother was staring at the cornucopia centerpiece as if praying it would swallow her whole. Pierce's face was slack, his eyes darting between Ainsley, me, and my father, a spectator at a tennis match he didn't understand. For 3 months after she came home, Ainsley continued, Chloe lived in a world of silence. We tried everything. Speech therapists, child psychologists, specialists from Boston, they all pushed her. They used flashcards and prompts and tried to force her to make sounds. And she just retreated further and further inside herself. She would sit under the kitchen table and just hum. For hours, her gaze, which had softened in memory, now hardened as it returned to my father. We were desperate. We were terrified we had lost her. And then a social worker at the hospital gave my mom a number for a nurse who sometimes did private in-home sessions for post-ICU trauma cases, a nurse named Sloane Holloway. The name dropped onto the table, and the last piece of the puzzle slid into place. My father's face was a study in confusion. He had the look of a man who is very good at spinning any situation to his advantage, but for the first time in his life had been handed a story he couldn't possibly narrate. Sloane came to our house twice a week. Ainsley said, her voice thick with emotion now, but she didn't come with flashcards. She came with a sketch pad and a box of crayons. She didn't ask Chloe to speak. She got down on the floor with her, under the table, and just started drawing. She never pushed, she never prodded. She just sat with my sister in her silence and made it feel safe. She told Chloe, you don't have to talk until you're ready. You can just point. Or you can squeeze my hand. She gave her back control. I could feel tears welling in my own eyes, not of sadness, but of a strange, overwhelming validation. Hearing my own methods, my own philosophy of care, described by someone else in this room felt like a dream. One afternoon, Ainsley said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, about a month in, Sloane was drawing a picture of a garden, and Chloe, who hadn't made a voluntary sound in 4 months, pointed to the page, and she said very clearly, more purple. A strangled sob escaped my aunt's lips. Mr. Carmichael was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of awe and dawning comprehension. Ainsley finally let her gaze fall away from my father and looked at me, a real, genuine smile breaking through her tears. Sloane texted my mom from the driveway, just a picture of a purple crayon, and my mom and I just sat in the kitchen and held each other and cried. Because my sister's voice wasn't gone. It was just waiting for someone patient enough and kind enough to sit with her in the dark without needing anything for themselves. She wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, her composure returning like a tide. She turned back to my father, her expression now one of cold, hard judgment. "So, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice firm, "when you call what she does noble or a calling or almost like the Peace Corps, what you're telling everyone at this table is that the person who gave my sister back her voice, the person who saved my family, doesn't have a real job." She let the sentence hang in the air. "You told her not to mess this up for Pierce tonight. The truth is, you are not worthy of being in the same room as your daughter." The only sound in the ensuing silence was the grandfather clock in the hall, ticking off the seconds of my father's humiliation. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The master narrator had lost the plot. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time all night, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before, nothing. He had no defense, no spin, no condescending joke. He was just a man at a dinner table who had been exposed as a fool. The rest of the dinner was a wreck. Conversation sputtered back to life, but it was brittle and false. My uncle started talking loudly about the Patriots season. My mother began obsessively asking if anyone wanted more mashed potatoes. But the energy in the room had shifted fundamentally and forever. A truth had been spoken that could not be unspoken. My body, programmed by 3 decades of habit, began to move before my mind did. As plates emptied, I felt the familiar urge, the muscular twitch to stand up, to start stacking, to clear the evidence of the meal. I pushed my chair back. My hand reached for my own plate. And then I stopped. Halfway up, something in my spine solidified. I looked at my hand, hovering over the plate. I thought about the thousands of dishes I had cleared from that table. The hundreds of hours I had spent in that kitchen, washing and drying, while the real conversations, the ones between the people who mattered, happened in the living room. No one had ever explicitly told me to do it. I had just learned, through years of subtle reinforcement, that my value in this house was tied to my utility. To be still was to be useless. To be useless was to be invisible. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered myself back into my chair. I felt every eye at the table track the motion. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt seismic. The linen dish towel I'd tucked into my waistband earlier was still there, a little badge of servitude. I pulled it free. I folded it once, then again with the kind of meticulous care one might give a precious document. Then I placed it on the table next to my half-eaten slice of pie, a quiet public resignation. No one moved. The leftovers grew cold. My mother's hand fluttered towards a stack of plates and then fell back into her lap, defeated. My father stared at the folded towel on the polished mahogany like it was a piece of damning evidence. For the first time in the history of Holloway family gatherings, the mess just sat there, a silent testament to the work no one had ever seen. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, walked down the hall, grabbed my coat and my bag from the bench by the door, and stepped out into the cold November night. The screen door clicked shut behind me. I didn't run. I didn't slam anything. I just left. I sat on the top step of the porch, the frigid air a welcome shock to my system. I could hear the muffled, awkward sounds from inside, the scrape of a chair, a cabinet opening, then closing. Someone, my mother probably, was finally starting to clear the table. And the sound of her doing it alone was so foreign, so jarring, it made the whole night feel real. The front door creaked open, and Ainsley slipped out, wrapping a cardigan tightly around herself. She sat next to me on the steps, not asking permission, just joining me in the cold. We sat in silence for a full minute, listening to the wind in the bare trees. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I probably shouldn't have done that. It's not my family, not my place." I shook my head, a raw, painful laugh escaping my lips. "If you hadn't said it," I admitted, my own voice sounding strange to me, I would have spent the entire drive home convincing myself I was overreacting. Again, thank you. She told me more about Chloe, about the fear and the helplessness of that time. She described me, my work, with a clarity and respect I had never once received from my own blood. You were the only one who saw her, she said. Everyone else saw a problem to be solved. You saw a person who was hurting. The door opened again. This time it was Pierce. He looked smaller out here on the porch, stripped of the adoring audience and the flattering lighting of the dining room. He hovered for a moment before sitting on my other side, leaving a careful, awkward space between us. I didn't know all that about your sister, he said to Ainsley, but he was looking at the ground. Ainsley didn't answer him. She just looked at me, so I did. You never asked, Pierce, I said. There was no anger in my voice, just a flat, simple statement of fact. His jaw worked. He looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the grounds. You know how Dad is, he mumbled, falling back on the oldest excuse in the family playbook. And that's when something inside me finally snapped. I turned to face him fully. No. Stop. This is not about how Dad is. This is about you. You are my brother. You've sat across from me at 100 tables just like that one. You've watched him belittle my life's work for 20 years. You've accepted the praise while I took the hit. You've never once, not one single time, stepped in and said, hey, that's not fair. My sister is brilliant at what she does. He flinched. I don't like conflict. You don't like conflict? I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. What do you think my life in this family has been? You don't like conflict because you've never had to face it. The rest of us have been managing it for you your whole life. I've been your emotional bodyguard, and I didn't even know I'd taken the job. He finally looked at me. I'm sorry, he said. It sounded genuine, but it was too little and about 15 years too late. Just then, the porch light flickered on and off, my mother's signal, the nonverbal command, stop this, come inside, don't make a scene. And I realized I was done. I was done translating my needs into a language that wouldn't make anyone else uncomfortable. I stood up. Ainsley stood up with me. Pierce remained seated, a boy on a timeout step. I walked back inside, Ainsley a silent, supportive shadow behind me. My father was waiting for me in the hall, his arms crossed. His face was a thundercloud. Sloane, he began, his voice low and menacing. I don't know what you think you accomplished tonight, but you and that girl embarrassed this entire family. You made this whole evening about you. I looked at him, the architect of my smallness, the man who saw his daughter's lifetime of compassion as a rounding error on his balance sheet. We do a lot for you, he continued, his voice rising. We let you stay here. We've been generous. And this is the respect I get in my own home? The word generous was the key. It unlocked the final door. Generous, I said, my voice as cold and calm as the night air. You co-signed an $87,000 loan for Pierce's MBA. You refused me $15,000 for a down payment on a home. That's not generosity. That's an investment strategy. And I was a bad investment. He actually scoffed. Don't be dramatic. You chose that life. You're right, I said. I did, and I am done apologizing for it. I took a breath. It was time to set the terms. I won't be coming to this house for holidays anymore. My relationship with Mom will be separate, on my own terms. Outside of this house and outside of your influence, I turned to my brother, who had followed us inside and was now standing by the dining room archway, looking utterly lost. And Pierce, I said, my voice hardening, that $4,850 I loaned you on October 12th, 2018, I'll be emailing you a copy of the promissory note you signed. I expect the first payment within 30 days. The color drained from his face. My mother, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway with tears in her eyes, whispered, my name, Sloane, don't. But it was done. The final boundary wasn't just emotional, it was financial, it was documented. My father took a step toward me, his finger jabbing the air. If you don't like how this family works, you don't have to be a part of it. The old me would have heard that as a threat. The new me, the me that had been witnessed and validated by a near stranger, heard it as an invitation, as freedom. I know, I said, and the steadiness in my voice surprised even me. I don't. I hugged my mom, a quick, tight embrace. I walked to the door. As I passed my father, he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, you were always too sensitive. I didn't turn back. I walked out to my car, got in and shut the door. The sound was so final. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just put my hands on the steering wheel, took a deep, clean breath, and felt the weight of a lifetime of trying to be seen in a house full of mirrors finally lift. The consequences came in waves, reported to me by third parties. Ainsley called 2 weeks later. She'd broken up with Pierce. She told him she couldn't build a future with a man who stood by and watched his family diminish the people he claimed to love. He was, she said, a spectator in his own life. Carmichael quietly pulled out of 2 joint investments with my father, telling a mutual friend he didn't like the man's character. The big family Christmas that year was hosted by my aunt because, as she told me over the phone, things just feel too tense at your dad's place. My life, meanwhile, began to fill with color. The empty spaces on my calendar where obligatory family visits used to be were replaced by things I chose. Hikes with friends, a book club with other nurses, quiet dinners with Ainsley and her family, where they asked about my work with genuine interest, and no one ever handed me a dish towel. One day, I got an email from Ainsley. The subject line was, "Chloe has a request." It was an invitation to her elementary school's Bravery Showcase. Chloe was going to read a poem. "She really wants you to be there," Ainsley wrote. No pressure, but it would mean the world to her. I walked into that school cafeteria, a place filled with the smell of floor wax and cookies, and found a seat. No one here knew my father. No one here was measuring my worth. When Chloe's name was called, she walked up to the microphone, clutching a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a gift I'd given her when she left the hospital. She looked out at the crowd, took a deep breath, and spotted me. A tiny, relieved smile flickered across her face. "My name is Chloe," she said, her voice clear and strong. "A while ago, I was very sick, and I got very scared, and I stopped talking. But I met a friend who taught me that you don't have to be loud to be brave." She read her poem, a short, beautiful thing about a bird learning to sing again after a storm, and when she finished, the room erupted in applause. But she didn't go back to her seat. She ran off the stage, right to me, and threw her arms around my neck. In front of everyone, she whispered in my ear, "Thank you, Sloane. You're my brave friend." And in that moment, sitting in a folding chair in a noisy cafeteria, being hugged by a 9-year-old girl, I felt more seen, more valued, and more successful than I ever could have at my father's polished table. Here's what I learned. It's the lesson I had to live to understand. You must treat financial agreements with family with the same rigor you'd use with a stranger. Document everything. A simple, signed piece of paper isn't an act of distrust. It's an act of clarity. It's a map that prevents everyone from getting lost in their own convenient, self-serving version of history. Memory is emotional, but a signature is a fact. Some families are not a circle of warmth. They are a pyramid scheme of approval, and only the people at the very top ever feel secure. Respect that is conditional on your silence isn't respect. It's a hostage situation. And you can't heal in the same environment that made you sick. You just can't. My father still believes I'm ungrateful. My brother is still wondering why the world stopped bending to his will. They are living with the natural consequences of their own choices. An apology that comes without a change in behavior is just a speed bump on the way to the next offense. I chose to get off that road. So, I'll ask you the question I finally had to ask myself sitting in my car in that dark driveway. In your life, whose comfort have you been prioritizing over your own clarity? Whose version of your story have you been accepting as truth? And what would it look like for you to finally put down the dish towel, fold it neatly, and just stay seated at the table?